Mindfulness Revolution. Back in 2015, we did a meditation class here that was based in part on a book called Waking Up, a guide to spirituality without religion. There it is, by Sam Harris, published back in 2014. That name, Sam Harris, might be familiar to y'all because he's the same guy who wrote a book back in 2006 that was called Letter to a Christian Nation. That was a book that was designed to, I like to say that it was designed to equip the resistance. It was designed to help people stand up to the religious bullies who even back then were trying to justify discrimination and oppression in the name of Christianity. You know the folks I'm talking about. They want to use the Bible to legislate what goes on in the privacy of people's homes, but they're not very eager to follow the example of Jesus when it comes to things like dealing with poverty and hunger and illness and things like that. Here's a quote from the book that I think illustrates the big problem we find when we try to use the Bible to enforce a moral code, okay? He says, "We read the Golden Rule and judge it to be a brilliant distillation of many of our ethical impulses. And then we come across another of God's teachings on morality. If a man discovers on his wedding night that his bride is not a virgin, he must stone her to death on her father's doorstep." Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 13 through 21. Yes, that's really in the Bible, which might explain why women seem to be a special target when it comes to religious moralizing, and that's not just in the Jewish and the Christian religions. Sam Harris is very critical of all religions, which is why he got the undeserved reputation of being a guy who simply hates religion and everything that is even vaguely associated with religion. That's why it was so surprising for many people to see that he had written a book on spirituality, Waking Up, a guide to spirituality without religion. And he wrote something very interesting, I think, in that book on the topic of religion. Here it is. "I had viewed organized religion as merely a monument to the ignorance and superstition of our ancestors. But I now knew that Jesus, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, and other saints and sages of history had not all been epileptics, schizophrenics, or frauds. I still considered the world's religions to be mere intellectual ruins maintained at enormous economic and social cost, but I now understood that important psychological truths could be found in the rubble." That's quite a switcheroo. Sam Harris is a scientist, by the way. He has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, which studies the interrelationship between what we call mind and brain. But what a lot of people didn't know is that he also has a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and he studied Hindu and Buddhist meditation in Asia for over a year. So he's done the work. And he knew that all major religions had some form of meditative or contemplative practice. And so it was simply not fair, or for him not reasonable, to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. The empirical evidence was starting to show the benefits that can come from these contemplative and meditative practices. Now today, we hear this word mindfulness being used as an umbrella term for different kinds of meditation and contemplation. I don't think that's 100% accurate, but for our purposes, it's good enough. So here's what he has to say about mindfulness. The literature on its psychological benefits is now substantial. There is nothing spooky about mindfulness. It is simply a state of clear, non-judgmental and undistracted attention to the contents of consciousness, whether pleasant or unpleasant. Cultivating this quality of mind has been shown to reduce pain, anxiety, and depression, and improve cognitive function, and even produce changes in gray matter density in regions of the brain related to learning and memory, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. So in case you hadn't noticed, there has been sort of a mindfulness revolution going on in this country for about maybe 10 years or better now. In fact, this next slide up here is going to show you over on the right, that goes back to 2003, Time magazine. The cover says The Mindful Revolution, which is where I stole or borrowed the title of the talk today. And the one over here is the February 3rd, 2014, The Science of Meditation. So they were talking about it. It got the cover story on Time magazine. It broke out of the ashrams and the monasteries, and it came into the boardroom and the locker room. And now there's an entire magazine, check this out, an entire magazine devoted to mindfulness. This one is called, the magazine is called Mindful, and every month there's a different citizen on the front showing and basically giving their testimonial to what the practice has done for them. Now, this is nothing new to those of us who have been a part of the Unity movement. Mindfulness and meditation have been a core practice in Unity since the very beginning back in 1890. Last month, as a matter of fact, I talked about how meditation was one of the unique gifts that Unity brought to Western spiritual practice long before people knew what yoga or Zen was. Our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, seemed to have reached the same conclusion as Sam Harris about the benefits of meditation, but Charles referred to the practice as the silence. And he had to teach himself because there were no meditation teachers back then. So the language he used was unique. It was Charles. It was his version of how he taught himself meditation. The language is a little bit different, but he's really talking about the same thing. What Charles wanted to know was if there's more to life than just our chattering, constantly churning mind that likes to tell stories and create opinions and judgments and commentaries about every single little thing, every sight, every sound, every smell, every experience. He wants to know if there's something beyond that. So here's how Charles Fillmore described his process. This is what he did. I then commenced sitting in the silence every night at a certain hour and tried to get in touch with God. There was no enthusiasm about it, no sole desire, but cold, calculating business method. I was there on time every night and tried all conceivable ways to realize that my mind was in touch with the Supreme Mind. I kept at it month after month. So he calls it getting in touch with God or Supreme Mind. Today, it's described differently, and I'm going to use the words of Sam Harris now to put this into a more modern perspective, more modern terms. Here's what Sam Harris tells us. He says, most of us spend our time seeking happiness and security without acknowledging the underlying purpose of our search. Each of us is looking for a path back to the present. We're trying to find good enough reasons to be satisfied now, right, with what is. Then he goes on to say, how we pay attention to the present moment largely determines the character of our experience, and therefore the quality of our lives. Mystics and contemplatives have made this claim for ages, but a growing body of scientific research now bears it out. So, once Sam Harris finally learned how to be truly mindful and to really pay attention to the present moment and to cultivate that state of clear, non-judgmental, undistracted attention to the contents of consciousness that he talked about earlier, which is what Charles Fillmore described as the silence. Once he learned how to do that, this is how Sam Harris describes the insight that he discovered from that. He said this: "It was simply obvious that love, compassion, and joy in the joy of others extended without limit. The experience was not of love growing, but of its being no longer obscured. Love was, as advertised by mystics and crackpots through the ages, a state of being. How had we not seen this before? And how could we overlook it ever again?" Okay, now remember, that's a scientist and a harsh critic of religion talking. I think it's a powerful testimonial. Of course, not everyone thinks that mindfulness is a good thing. Occasionally they talk about having some kind of a class or a time in schools for silence and meditation, and many conservative Christians condemn it because they say that it is teaching a pagan religion. Because it comes from pagan religion, don't put it in the schools in any form. I mean, they try to strip it of any religious language or baggage, and they're still in it. And I'll tell you what, I heard this from a fundamentalist Christian friend of mine. The other thing that they say is that, and they're pretty sure of this, that when you meditate, you empty your mind, all right? And what happens when you empty your mind is that it makes it easy for demons to come in and take over. And for those of you who have the stomach for it, you can look up a guy named John Ankerberg, who's one of these TV preachers, and every now and then he goes off on a rant about how meditation is allowing yourself to be possessed by demons. And I knew this person, and I remember I said something like, "Oh, well, that's interesting." That was at the time when I was attending this Buddhist monastery, and so this was their way of telling me that my soul was in mortal peril. And so I thought at that point, I just said, "Well, that's interesting." I didn't say much beyond that, but I can tell you what I was thinking. What I really wanted to say was, "Oh no, my friend, you have that backwards. You have to have an empty head to believe in demons in the first place." But see, I developed control and compassion through my meditation practice, so I kept my mouth shut. You won't win over folks like that with reason. You won't win them over or change their minds with facts. So it's usually best to just move along, get on with your life. Get on with your life. Try this practice. And over the years, you've probably been hearing me talk about meditation and mindfulness, and I've said that the practice itself is absolute simplicity, that you can learn it in about 10 minutes. Well, I've now revised that time frame down to 2 minutes. All right? And to prove it, I have an animated video where a laboratory mouse will teach you how to meditate in just 2 minutes. But before that video, I'm going to show you another short one which explains, with the same narrator, why mindfulness is really a superpower. Enjoy.
You may have heard this word mindfulness. It's become something of a buzz phrase of late. But I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us, we normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. with just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation. I believe that meditation and mindfulness are the next big public health revolution. In the 1940s, if you told somebody you were going running, they would have said, who's chasing you? But then what happened next? The scientists swooped in, they showed that physical exercise is really good for you, and now all of us do it, and if we don't, we feel guilty about it. And that's where I think we're headed with mindfulness and meditation. It's going to join the pantheon of no-brainers like brushing your teeth, eating well, and taking the meds your doctor prescribed for you. Let me just close by saying, mindfulness is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not going to render your life a nonstop parade of unicorns and rainbows. Nonetheless, this is a superpower, and one that is accessible by you immediately. Despite what you may have heard, meditation does not involve joining a group, paying any fees, wearing any special outfits, sitting in a funny position, or believing in anything in particular. It is simple, secular, scientifically validated exercise for your brain. You don't have to do it yet, but just so you know, here are the 3 steps. 1, sit with your back straight and your eyes closed. 2, notice the feeling of your breath coming in and going out. Pick a spot where it's most prominent. Usually that's your nose or your chest or your belly, and just focus your full attention on the feeling of your breath coming in and going out. Now, as soon as you try to do this, your mind's going to go nuts. You're going to start thinking about, what am I going to have for lunch? Why did I say that dumb thing to my boss? Your brain's going to go nuts, and that's fine. The whole game is to notice when you've gotten lost and to start over, and then to start over again, and again, and again. Every time you do that, it's like a bicep curl for your brain, and it shows up on the brain scan. Scientists have found this in the lab. It's also, by the way, a radical act. You're breaking a lifetime's habit of walking around in a fog of projection and rumination, and you're actually focusing on what's happening right now. Meditation is unlike anything you do in the rest of your life. Failure is actually success. As I said, the whole game is just trying, failing, starting again, failing, starting again. Here's my advice. You should be meditating every day, 5 to 10 minutes a day. That's it. This doesn't require some giant investment. I don't care how busy you are, you have 5 to 10 minutes to give this a shot. I guarantee you it will make a big difference.
Okay. There you have it. You know, there's something about, what is it about an animated mouse that creates this instant bond of credibility and trust, right? Although I will say, I do want to point something out there that they all demonstrated sitting on the floor cross-legged. You know, if you want to, you can. You don't have to do it. These are good chairs here. You know, a chair works. In fact, in our culture, we sit in chairs. We don't sit on the floor. So sit in a chair. Just make sure it's not so comfortable that you're going to want to fall asleep, you know. Something with an upright back. If you need a little cushion in the lumbar area, that works perfectly well. And both of those videos, in case you didn't catch the name in the credits, both of those videos were narrated by this guy here. That's Dan Harris. He is the anchor for Nightline. He's also the weekend co-anchor of Good Morning America on ABC. He's no relation to Sam Harris, but they came out with books at almost exactly the same time. Dan Harris wrote this book here called 10% Happier. How I Tamed the Voice in My Head, Reduced Stress Without Losing My Edge, and Found Self-Help That Actually Works. A true story. He credits mindfulness with saving his career and saving his health. And in fact, in July, during our Frontiers of Consciousness class, we're going to see a presentation that he made at the Google campus about that whole process, showing how he went through a time of having panic attacks and really threatening his career to the point where, you know, he is now a well-established anchor on ABC. So he credits mindfulness with saving his career, saving his health, and that's where we're going to pick up again next week when we talk about mindfulness and health. See you then.